Welcome to the funnel. My name is John Shea, and I'm the president of Alignment Group. This is episode number 183 of the funnel. High impact sales onboarding includes the customer. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you to head on over to alignment-group.com, go to episode 183 or any of the episodes, and subscribe to the funnel. If you subscribe to the funnel, you don't have to take notes. I will send you the show notes. All right, let's jump in. The agenda today, we're going to talk about the customer impact, buyer persona, the buying process, and the sales process, and how all of this relates to sales onboarding. So we're going to start with customer impact. In the traditional world of sales, we usually live in the quota focus versus customer focus. In other words, we're trying to drive revenue at all costs. Now, if I listen to all the marketing pundits, sales reps are overzealous and pushy and selfish and only think of themselves, and all they're after is the sale. That's what they've been led to believe over the years, and that's the narrative around why we should do inbound marketing. And I would argue that's not really the narrative you should be using for inbound marketing. Inbound marketing is a great way to reach a broader audience in numbers, while at the same time narrowing it down to the ideal prospect and drawing them into you and creating potentially good leads for your company. That's a great way to drive leads into the system. You don't have to do it at the expense of the salesperson or the sales process and the whole conversation wrapped around the old way. But the fact of the matter is we are focused on quota. We are focused on revenue. And I think the onboarding process should entail some of that. You need to know the numbers and the metrics you're going to hit. But I think more importantly, a customer focus. What can you do to satisfy the customer? Where are their pain points? How can I help? And if you begin that knowledge transfer throughout onboarding, you'll have somebody that will go out there with the idea in mind, I have to drive revenue because it's how I get paid, how the company makes money, and how they stay in business. And without me, this revenue doesn't happen. And there's a lot of moving parts within a company that make that happen. But the sales rep is the point or the tip of the spear there. So I would suggest that focusing on satisfying the customer and how you can help the customer and how you can benefit the customer, while at the same time laying down the tracks for metrics in terms of the numbers and the revenue, et cetera, puts a more well-rounded sales rep in front of the prospect. They understand the pain points very quickly. They can ramp up very quickly, and they're getting in that mindset of how can I help you solve your problem? So that brings me to buyer persona. Okay, this is a big conversation point around marketing, folks. And I guess if I were to define a buyer persona from a sales perspective, it would be ideal customer. So we talk about that, right? So the buyer persona from a marketing perspective takes on a little bit of a different connotation, but there's a ton of commonalities there. Okay, in the marketing world, they're really kind of taking a deep dive in who this person is, not only professionally, but personally, and how that relates to the way in which they conduct business online. And how can we draw them in to our content, like what we're doing, and then reach out to us for additional help in solving their problem? That's from the marketing perspective. From the sales rep perspective, it's the ideal customer, right? We're looking for who's the contact point within a company. Who do we need to talk to? How do we make those connections through LinkedIn, through events, et cetera, et cetera? And what does that look like from a business perspective? Where are their pain points? See common ground with marketing. So I think the marketing buyer persona evolves or kind of merges with the ideal customer, and laying that groundwork during the onboarding process so they know exactly where they're going, right? Who they're talking to. So if we think about it, we're talking about pain points. We're talking about driving ways to help the customer while at the same time laying down revenue and quota. We have to teach them in the onboarding process who they're going to talk to and how they're going to make that connection. And I say that because different industries require different methodologies for connecting. In the IT world, you might connect differently than you would in the architectural world if you're selling architectural services or whatever. The idea would be for the sales rep through the onboarding process to get a really good feel who it is they're talking to. And there might be more than one. Oftentimes, there is more than one. There is more than one ideal customer or buyer persona, and they have to get a real deep understanding of how that person interacts in your world. And if they're going through the onboarding process and you're laying all this information in front of them, of course, the company information and the product knowledge, when they get in front of somebody or they start trying to make connections, they're going to apply the knowledge they've been given here in the onboarding process to their day-to-day sales routine. So a lot of times we're kind of focused on tactical things like tactical things like, how many calls do I make? What does that call look like? Scripting it out. What we're talking about is a deeper understanding of how these people act and interact and what you can do to drive business. That brings me to buying process. Simple, right? What are the stages? What are the stages that the buyer goes through in your industry? Again, there might be multiple buyer personas and the buying processes might be slightly different. Clearly identify each stage and what are the key indicators for those stages in the time frame. So let's say your sales cycle is 90 days. You really want to know how those stages play out over a 90-day period. What's in those stages and what are the indicators the buyer's ready to go to the next stage? Why? Why do you do that in onboarding? Again, as they begin to make connections, right? They're applying what they're learning. You might say, well, that's simple. I am going to touch on something that we're kind of almost, really, this is going to be a shorter podcast than most. We're probably about halfway through this. Keep in mind, as I'm talking about these things, like buying process, I wouldn't lay out every stage and just do the fire hose. Last podcast, I talked about that. What I would do is focus on those stages as the rep is beginning the process of connecting with clients and going through those stages. So you might have a broad overview, but as they're getting their feet wet and they're starting to get into their work and make connections and talk to potential prospects and they're getting into those stages, that's where the learning comes in. You really layer it on top those first 90 days. So at the end of that process, they have a real deep understanding. They know the time frame. They know the key indicators. They know each stage. That's from a buying process perspective, that's how you lay that out. That's how you lay out the information in ways and chunk it down in ways that a sales rep can understand it throughout the onboarding process. Yes, you're going to kind of go through the buyer persona. You're going to go through the ideal prospect initially. And you're going to give them a lot of information around that and the problems you solve, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to use that information as you begin to move forward in the buying process. Let's say it's like the second month, they're beginning to make really good connections. Now you're in the stages, right? So you're saying, look, here's where this person, this ideal prospect, this is where they come into the buying process. This is the stages of that process. You're in stage 1 or stage 2. See, these are the identifiers, and you're coaching them through that throughout the onboarding. Here's the key indicators. The next step is this. This is your time frame. It's not sitting in front, throwing up a PowerPoint in a classroom and then sending them off. It's onboarding them as they're going through this. So I've said this before, right? Do you teach somebody something they're going to need at the end of the 90-day process or at the beginning? Now, the real value here is teaching this process as they're moving along. Same goes for sales process, right? We're talking about sales process as well. The sales process marries the buying process. How do you deliver that to a new rep when you're onboarding? Well, first, I would say with sales process, early and often. That's the big thing, right? Lay out the sales process, make sure they understand it, make sure that there are milestone-centric stages, and you begin the role-playing against the buyer persona, against how the buyer's process is laid out. That's where the real value comes in. You take the sales process, you start it early, and as you're walking through the buying process and the sales process throughout onboarding, you're role-playing what potentially could happen. Now, I had a manager that worked for me that was very good at role-playing Fridays. He had a very young out of college team. He just graduated from school or maybe a year or so in the business. And Friday mornings he would have a meeting, coffee, donuts, whatever, and they would sit around and role play scenarios throughout the buying process. Just as a general rule, give me an opportunity. Let's talk about one of your opportunities. Where are you? Okay, let's role play that. In the car on the way to appointments, let's role play what happened. Let's role play what potentially could happen here. What if this happens? What if that happens? And you reinforce it over and over and over again throughout that buying process. Should you do it after when you're coaching calls? Yes. But early and often is going to drive the business for you. Milestone-centric stages are critical to the success of a sales process, and marrying that to the buyer's process is really important. So the only way you're going to be able to do this in the onboarding is spending a lot of time coaching that and role-playing that and following along their 90-day path, right? Your 90-day path here, I'm saying 90 days. It could be 60 days. It could be 120 days, depending on the complexity of what you do, is designed to initially get them up and running as quickly as possible, doing things that normal companies would have you interrupt employees to do, but you're good at onboarding. You have them already in the flow. Now, once they start to create prospects and put prospects into the pipeline, what's next for you? Well, what's next for you is to start talking about the buying process and how the buyer buys. You've laid out ideal prospect. You've laid out buyer persona. Now they're making calls or getting appointments. Let's talk about buying process. Here's what happens. And way back there, you went over the sales process to make sure they understood it. You did it a few times. You role played it a little bit. Now you're introducing buying process. You're marrying sales process to that. And every step of the way through the prospects they're identifying early in their career with you, you're role playing that sales process. You're delivering it in a way that they will understand it. It will become second nature, and it will be something that they do as a matter of fact, as a matter of course. They're not going to develop their own way of selling. I've heard that 1,000 times. Well, our team has their own way. We've had some success with that. You're not going to grow that way. And your own way basically says, I don't have time to manage them, so I'm going to allow them to kind of do what they want to do on their own. And I don't think that that's practical. And I don't think that's going to help you grow. So to summarize everything I've talked about here, it's all about focusing on the customer, understanding that quota and revenue and metrics around that are really important, laying that track down, but understanding to get to that endpoint, it's about helping the customer. It's about driving responses to their needs. Yes, sales has changed. It's not in the way that people think. Information and data is available to them. They don't need you for that. What they need is your expertise in helping them solve a problem. So focus on problem solving, introduce the sales process early, make sure they understand the milestone-centric stages, do some role playing, and as they get into the calls and get into the opportunities, you bring in the buyer's process. And you marry the sales process up to that, and you're walking through each stage with them through their onboarding. So by the time they're done onboarding, this is second nature to them. They can be successful doing it your way. That's the value in making the customer a central part of your onboarding process. Don't forget to subscribe to the funnel. Mentioned it at the beginning of the podcast. alignment-group.com/the funnel. You can find us on Facebook, Alignment Group, at Shay John R is my Twitter handle, LinkedIn, Google+. As always, email me, jshay@alignment-group.com. Questions, comments, anything you need, just fire it off. Stop by the website. Great stuff there. Check it out. Good blog page. We have all kinds of things you can download, so feel free to stop by and check us out anytime. As always, thank you for subscribing and keep filling the funnel.